Welcome to Present Perfect. No grammar, but plenty of history. I'm Don Congdon, your host and guide, helping you explore how the past reaches out and touches the present. This is podcast number 113. Today we discuss one of the most influential Bible translations in history. No, it's not the King James Version. We'll get there in about 1200 years. The translation that we're discussing today was finished around 405 and remained influential for almost 1,000 years. Still in use today in the Roman Catholic Church, it's a major milestone in Bible translation history. By now, some of you have probably guessed which Bible we're discussing, the Latin Vulgate. The Latin Vulgate's history is both complex and confusing. To begin with, the name creates problems for several reasons. Let's deal with them right now and then move on to the rather convoluted history behind the translation itself. Many people mistakenly believe that the word Vulgate means that this Bible is written in vulgar Latin. As I hope you recall from our last podcast, vulgar Latin was the Latin of everyday people, while classical and late Latin were the more formal and scholarly versions of the language. There was nothing intrinsically crude or off-color about vulgar Latin. While it's compelling to think of the Vulgate being an example of an early translation in the language of everyday people, that's not the case. The Vulgate's Latin is late Latin, and a rather polished form of it at that. Just as many people praise the King James Version for its elevated style of English, so too have many praised the Vulgate for its Latin. What does Vulgate mean then? It comes from the Latin phrase versio vulgata, which just means the version commonly used. In other words, it was the Bible in common use by the Church. In some ways, this term is analogous to our more modern expression, authorized version. Okay, we've gotten the name's meaning out of the way, but now we open a second can of worms. Hang on to your earbuds because this can be confusing. As I'm sure you remember from our last podcast, the world of late antiquity already had a family of Latin translations in circulation, what today we call the Vetus Latina. In the late 4th century, it was this version that people called the Latin Vulgate. At the same time, certain Greek versions of the Bible went by the name Greek Vulgate. In all cases, the term simply meant that these were the versions in common use. At the beginning of the 5th century, when the New Latin translation came out, people started to call the original Latin Vulgate by the term Vetus Latina, which means Old Latin. Old in this case means that it is old compared to the new version that had just appeared. The new Bible translation did not immediately appropriate the name Latin Vulgate. It went by a variety of names until the 13th century when the philosopher and scholar Roger Bacon referred to it by this name. Eventually, the name stuck, and we've used this term ever since. Got it? Okay. Now that we've settled all of that, we're ready to move on to the history of the translation itself. And just to prevent further confusion, from now on, whenever I use the term Latin Vulgate, you can safely assume that I'm referring to the new Bible, not the old one. The Latin Vulgate began life not as a complete Bible translation project, but as a revision of the Vetus Latina. In 382, Damasus, the Bishop of Rome, decided that the 4 Gospels in the Vetus Latina needed a facelift. He wanted them to be updated and improved in light of the best Greek manuscripts available. To achieve this goal, he commissioned his secretary and personal friend to do the job, a scholar with the impressive name of Eusebius Sophronius Hieronymus. This Eusebius, by the way, is not the Eusebius commissioned by Constantine to produce the 50 Bibles that we discussed back in podcast number 109. The man we meet today has quite a history of his own. And if you find his name a bit of a mouthful, don't worry. I'll be referring to him by his more common name, Jerome. Jerome is one of those figures from church history that you're not quite sure what to do with. He was born in the part of the world that today includes the countries of Croatia and Slovenia. Intellectually bright, he went to Rome in his teens to study philosophy and rhetoric. Like many students, he led a rather wild life, engaging in various stunts and enjoying the local girls a bit too much. After several years of struggling with guilt over his behavior, As well as skepticism about Christianity, he overcame his doubts and began to study theology. During his young adult years, he was drawn towards a movement that was gaining traction among the very devout. Rejecting the comforts of civilization, they chose to live in the deserts as hermits. This practice later expanded into the vast medieval institution of monasticism. Jerome was a superb scholar, and during his wandering years became particularly expert with textual and language studies. He also became the friend and advisor of Damasus, which explains how he eventually received the commission to revise the Vetus Latina Gospels. In his mid-30s, when he started the revision program, Jerome found the lure of Bible translation and textual study irresistible. He spent the next 23 years on it. As far as we know, beyond Damasus's original project, which Jerome finished fairly quickly, he never received further translation commissions. The work that culminated in the Vulgate was done without official support or financial assistance. Apparently, he translated because he enjoyed it and believed it to be worthwhile. I, for one, certainly can't criticize this. Along with his various scholarly activities, Jerome continued to be active in promoting early forms of monasticism and encouraged women to enter communities as consecrated virgins. His popularity with wealthy and influential women led to accusations of improper relations. He also encouraged a rather wild young woman to become an ascetic, which caused her weak health to break down and led to her untimely death. The uproar over this forced him to leave Rome. After traveling around Egypt and the Middle East for a while, he settled in the city of Bethlehem, accompanied by a number of disciples. Among these was a wealthy widow named Paula, who financially supported his work. Interestingly, she was the mother of the young woman whose death forced Jerome out of Rome. Establishing himself in a cave believed by some to be the birthplace of Jesus, Jerome continued his writing and translation work. We now come back to the Latin Vulgate, most of which Jerome produced from his cave in Bethlehem. And we must now open our third can of worms because Jerome's translation had a complex history of its own. It's fairly clear that the four Gospels in the Vulgate are the ones Jerome produced for Damasus. But the rest of the New Testament appears to have been translated by someone else at a slightly later date. Nobody's sure who did this work, although there are a few candidates. We also don't know if Jerome translated the rest of the New Testament. It's possible that he did and the work was lost. This could explain the presence of another translation within the Vulgate. On the other hand, we're very confident that Jerome translated the entire Old Testament. But he did it in a number of stages, the reason that the Vulgate's history is so complicated. It all comes down to the Psalms. When Jerome was revising the Gospels for Damasus, he also updated the translation of the Psalms contained in the Vetus Latina. But during his years in Bethlehem, he decided that he didn't really like his work on the Psalms. He therefore did an entirely new translation using a source manuscript that he didn't have access to when he lived in Rome. We need to go on a brief tangent to discuss this manuscript as it's rather important. We must also meet another significant and controversial figure in church history, a fellow named Origen. Origen lived about 150 years before Jerome, and like him was both a theologian and a textual scholar. He wrote prolifically and significantly influenced the doctrinal path that the church was to take in the centuries ahead. In fact, it's not too much of a stretch to say that Roman Catholic doctrine owes a lot to Origen. This is the reason that I have mixed feelings about the man. But Origen had one quality that I can't quarrel with. He loved the Scriptures and spent a lot of his time trying to produce the most accurate version of the Old Testament possible. His work culminated in the manuscript that our friend Jerome consulted as he developed the Latin Vulgate. In Origen's day, most Christians considered the Septuagint, not the available family of Hebrew manuscripts, to be the most authoritative Old Testament. Some were quite dogmatic about this point and expressed hostility to anyone who wished to go back to the earlier sources. Origen, however, disagreed and felt that the Hebrew manuscripts were important and should be used to identify possible problems in the Septuagint. To make this task easier, he compiled a book to help textual scholars. It came to be called the Hexapla because it had 6 columns of text arranged side by side. The first column contained the Hebrew scriptures taken from the manuscripts available in Origen's time. Next came a column with the Hebrew rendered into the Greek alphabet. Columns 3, 4, and 6 contained 3 3rd-century Greek translations of the Old Testament. The 5th column was the most important. It contained the Septuagint translation along with notes, special symbols, and other information to inform the reader how it differed from the Hebrew and from the other 3 translations. The Hexapla was the forerunner of modern critical texts, compilations of many manuscripts designed to help the scholar establish what was likely the text of the biblical autographs. We'll discuss critical texts in much more detail when we come to modern Bible translations. While living in Bethlehem, Jerome had access to a theological library that Origen had founded in the city of Caesarea Maritima. A copy of the Hexapla was available here, so Jerome consulted it when he retranslated the Psalms. He may also have translated other Old Testament books at the same time, but little besides the Psalms has survived. Still not satisfied, Jerome decided that the Old Testament should be freshly translated from Hebrew, the closest he could come to the original documents. At the end of the 4th century, he began this work, ultimately producing a complete Old Testament translation into Latin. Besides the canonical Old Testament books, Jerome translated a few of the apocryphal books into Latin as well. Some of these were translated from the original language. Since he didn't know Aramaic, Jerome employed a Jewish translator to help him with apocryphal books written in this language. Jerome wanted his readers to distinguish genuine scripture from apocrypha, so he marked all apocryphal books with a special symbol called an obelus. It looks something like a dagger, or the division symbol that you use in elementary school math. From his letters, it's clear that Jerome had mixed feelings about the apocrypha and wanted it clearly differentiated from true scripture. The Church didn't embrace Jerome's new Latin Bible immediately. Some preferred the Vetus Latina and resisted the new translation. Others took exception to the fact that the Old Testament wasn't based on the Septuagint. But over time, Jerome's Bible became the version preferred by the Church. Many varieties of the Latin Vulgate exist. Before movable type printing was invented in the 1450s, all Bibles were hand-copied. For this reason, there are no standardized editions. Versions containing Jerome's work mixed in with pieces of the Vetus Latina are common. Beginning in the 9th century, many copies of the Vulgate contain Jerome's second version of the Psalms rather than the third. Almost all versions of the Vulgate include apocryphal books since the Roman Catholic Church eventually elevated them to the status of being second-tier canon. Not until the mid-1500s was an official version of the Latin Vulgate formally adopted by the Roman Catholic Church. By this time, however, the Reformation was in full swing, and Protestants were focusing their attention on new translations into many different languages. We're almost out of time, but I have a few comments left. In its era, the Latin Vulgate was a significant translation and one that exemplifies several important principles of Bible translation. First, it wasn't a language that was accessible to many people. Secondly, it reflects a genuine effort to go back to the earliest original language source documents whenever possible. Finally, it met a need that's ongoing to this day, the need to retranslate the Bible in response to changes in language and improvements in textual scholarship. By the time of the Reformation, the Latin Vulgate had outstayed its welcome and became an impediment rather than a help. It also became the center of a pattern that we see repeating over and over through church history. This pattern is a tendency to value a translation above the scriptures themselves. Just as 5th century Christians didn't want to let go of the Septuagint, so too did Reformation-era religious figures resist new translations of the Bible. We'll see our friend the Latin Vulgate again in future podcasts, but for now we're finished with it. Next time, we take a look at the first English Bible. You'll hardly recognize it because the language it's in, although the ancestor of our own, is interestingly different. So until next time, I'm Don Congdon and this is Present Perfect. Have a great day. Present Perfect is a copyright of Don Congdon. Music is copyright Footage Firm Incorporated. Scripture quotations are from the New American Standard Bible, which is a copyright of the Lockman Foundation.